Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the surprisingly elegant science that keeps, well, immense floating cities from sinking to the bottom of the ocean. I mean, if you've ever stood on a dock and just craned your neck up at one of these absolute maritime marvels, you've probably caught yourself wondering, how on earth is this physically possible, right? Well, today, we're going to break down the exact principles at play. 200,000. Take a second and just try to wrap your head around that number. That represents the astonishing weight, in tons, of a modern cruise ship. We are talking about millions of pounds of metal, machinery, and materials just sitting effortlessly on the open water. It's wild. When you really think about it, it honestly seems completely impossible. These massive structures operate as literal floating cities. They're carrying thousands of passengers, full-scale restaurants, swimming pools filled with thousands of gallons of water, and even multi-level theaters. Yet the whole shebang stays safely and securely on top of the water. It totally defies our basic intuition. So, what's the actual secret here? How do they float? This brings us to a really fascinating physical paradox that we need to unravel. How does something so unbelievably heavy, packed with so much infrastructure, not just plunge straight into the depths? Well, it turns out it's not magic. It's actually a beautifully simple scientific principle. To wrap our heads around this, let's look at a basic fact of nature. Most heavy objects made of dense materials, like a solid block of steel, they sink instantly when you drop them in water. And since a cruise ship's hull is built from heavy steel, you'd naturally expect it to behave exactly like that block and just drop like a stone the second it leaves dry dock. But here is exactly why it doesn't. A cruise ship is absolutely not a solid block of steel. Instead, think of it essentially as a giant steel shell that's holding air. A huge percentage of the ship's internal volume is actually just vast air-filled space. You've got the passenger cabins, the long hallways, sprawling storage areas, cavernous engine rooms. All of that interior space is essentially just trapped air. And that brings us to the crucial secret. Because of all this trapped air, the ship's overall average density drastically drops. So even with heavy steel forming the outer framework, when you combine that steel with all that empty space, the entire ship ends up being significantly less dense than the exact same volume of water. So density, not raw weight, is the real game changer here. Now, to truly understand how this lower average density actually keeps the ship up, we have to rewind a bit. Over 2 millennia, actually. This brings us to a groundbreaking discovery by the ancient Greek scientist Archimedes. More than 2,000 years ago, he managed to unlock the precise mathematical rule that makes the design of every single modern cruise ship possible today. What Archimedes realized was something fundamental about how water behaves. Whenever an object enters the water, it physically has to push water out of its way to make room for itself. We call this process displacement. You've definitely seen this in your own life. Like, say you step into a bathtub and you notice the water level rise as your body displaces the water. Same exact thing. But here is the truly magical part of his discovery. That displaced water doesn't just disappear or, passively move out of the way. It actually fights back. The water pushes back up against the bottom of the object with this invisible upward force known as buoyancy. And the more water that gets pushed aside, the stronger this upward buoyant push becomes. So let's look at how it all balances out in 4 steps. First, the enormous ship enters the ocean and pushes millions of gallons of water aside. Second, all that displaced water pushes back with a powerful upward buoyant force. Third, as long as that upward force equals or exceeds the total downward weight of the ship, well, step 4, the ship floats perfectly. It's just a continuous, incredible balancing act of natural forces. Now, you might be wondering, okay, but what happens when thousands of passengers actually board the ship with all their heavy luggage, tons of food, and huge amounts of fuel? Well, the ship simply sinks slightly deeper into the ocean. And by sinking deeper, it physically displaces even more water. That extra displaced water increases the upward buoyant force until the new, heavier total weight of the ship is perfectly balanced all over again. Okay, so we know exactly why it doesn't sink straight down. But given how ridiculously tall these floating structures are, sometimes they tower more than a dozen decks high into the sky and look incredibly top-heavy, we've got to ask another major question. How in the world do they stay upright without tipping over in the wind and the turbulent ocean waves? Engineers maintain perfect balance here through some incredibly clever design choices. First off, they use an exceptionally wide hull to spread the footprint across the water. Second, they create a really low center of gravity by packing the heaviest equipment, stuff like those gigantic engines and fuel tanks, at the very, very bottom. And finally, they use underwater stabilizer fins that actively adjust to the waves, drastically reducing any rolling and guaranteeing an upright, comfortable ride even in rough seas. So the next time you look at an enormous cruise ship, just remember, it isn't magic keeping it afloat. It's carefully calculated average density, smart engineering, and the immense, invisible buoyant forces of the ocean doing the heavy lifting. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to end on. If simply trapping air and displacing water can hold up a 200,000-ton city, what other supposedly impossible feats of human engineering are silently powered by the everyday laws of physics?